Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Urban Legends video. Well, I'm going to do this one and then probably one more to round out this particular series, so be on the lookout for the last one coming sometime this week. Lots of good suggestions. I'm going to hold off on some of the other ones for now, at least until I have a good number of other suggestions for another series. But otherwise, thank you as always for your recommendations, and again, I'll probably do something like this on the urban legend side within about another month or two, and I'll be looking for a different theme this time around, and I'll explain that to everybody here. This particular urban legend is quite fascinating because even to this day, this urban legend, people have not been able to prove whether even A, there was a person involved, or whether even B, if there was even paranormal statuses involved, or whether even C, if this was all just a hoax, a case of wild imaginations running rampant in this particular town. And it's kind of one of those deals where when that happens, a whole set of fantastical ideas come about that otherwise, under normal circumstances, would not even be considered. And what I'm talking about here is the urban legend that's known as the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. And this is an urban legend that occurred a good number of years back. You would have to go back to about the mid-1940s or so. So it's definitely not an urban legend that was more recent, and it kind of makes sense because if this were far more recent during this age, the advent of the cell phone, video cameras, surveillance cameras, everything like that, then certainly somebody like this would have been captured. But back then, being the 1940s, it makes sense that only pretty much eyewitness accounts makes up the majority of the descriptions associated with this Mad Gasser. So, again, this happened in Mattoon, Illinois. The specific year was 1944, and basically it was like this. There was a series of events that occurred in that town where people claim, those eyewitnesses, claim that there was a man, a potential man, because others think that it may actually have been something paranormal related, but we'll talk about that later on. But otherwise, that there was a man that was out there in that city that was purposefully spreading a form of noxious, almost deadly gas that either he utilized in his own invention, like his own type of gun that he had, or that he was able to capitalize on this gas coming from other places in that town, such as like a processing plant of some sort, and he used that to his advantage. But there were several victims associated with this noxious gas, and whatever this gas was, it actually was strong enough to paralyze people. And there weren't any victims that died, though, so I'll get that out of the way first. But there were several people there that, considering the circumstances surrounding them, if they were paralyzed, and in some cases they were coughing so violently, some of them could have died, especially if the idea of this Mad Gasser placing this gas around the people's homes so that way he could invade them, then he would have had his way with them. So he could have essentially killed some of these victims, but it never really got to that point. So again, you have to go back to 1944, Mattoon, Illinois. This is when it all started. And the first reported attack, the one that's been cited by pretty much everybody as being the first attack ever, because there were some other victims, I believe, that were earlier, but this was the actual first reported one, the first known instance that gained momentum. And this happened on August 31st, 1944, at the home of a gentleman named Urban Raif. And this is what happened. He said there was one early morning there on August 31st when he suddenly awoke to the smell of a very strange odor. And this odor was there in his home, in his bedroom. And this odor, he described it as being something that made him quote-unquote nauseous and weak. And the more that he smelled it, the more that he suddenly took it to the next level by vomiting. He was apparently vomiting really hard, either projectile vomiting or vomiting to the point where this was not something that he had done to that level before. His wife was right there with him, and she too smelled that particular gas. And so at first she thought that it was something involving domestic gas poisoning, but in the form of a pilot light that had gone out. Those of you that have pilot lights at home in your kitchen, you know exactly what I'm talking about, how important it is for that particular flame to keep on going, because if it doesn't, then gas will essentially fill the rest of the home if it's not stopped afterward. So she at first thought that there was some form of pilot light going out in the house, but then she too, after she was able to smell that odor for a little bit, found that she had her body was affected in a different manner. So her husband Urban was vomiting, but she found that she was paralyzed. She was unable to move from her bed at that point. She was paralyzed to the point where she could not move at all. Imagine how frightening that must be if you're in a situation where you're awake and you know you're awake, and this is not one of those nightmares or those things that people say sometimes they have at night where they are in a dreamlike state but they kind of wake up but they're still paralyzed. No, in this case she was 100% awake because again her husband had awoken her based on his actions and based on him vomiting left and right, and so she was 100% awoken, but she was completely paralyzed that night. But nothing really happened afterward, because other than that, either the gas or the smell went away at that point, and they were able to recuperate, and then that was it. There was no other point, no other person coming into the home. They did not see anybody in and around that area either, otherwise they would have reported it. So the attack just pretty much ended there. Attack being a loose quote unquote, because again, much of what I'm going to talk about here has been debated as to whether it truly happened in terms of an attack from a person, or if it was just random associations, random occurrences really that might have happened to people. And so the next day, September 1st, was another incident that occurred. My apologies, actually on that very same night there was a similar incident. This became known as the second incident because a neighbor right in that area, the neighbor to the house there owned by the Ruffs, he stated that whenever they had heard their daughter also coughing incessantly and coughing to the point where, okay, you know, something is going on. This is not the normal cough where you have to get something out of your throat like some lump. This is something else completely, like this person is almost choking on their coughs. They went to check on their daughter, or tried to check on their daughter, but this neighbor found that she too was also paralyzed and unable to leave her bed. So again, on that night, we had the Raffs that encountered that, at least the wife did, and then on that very same night, the neighbor also was awoken, this time not by their own coughing, but by the cough of their daughter, striking her at night and trying to get up to find out what's happening, but they could not check on their daughter because they too were paralyzed, just like Mr. Ruff's wife. So that was the second incident. The third incident that occurred was the very next day, but this is notable because it's the very first time that a reported description of the Mad Gasser and how this name came about. I tried to see if anybody, if there was any true source on how the Mad Gasser name came about, but I couldn't really find anything on there. But this third incident is again notable because it was the very first time somebody was able to report the description associated with this Mad Gasser. So there was another person there at that location there in the town, and they too reported, this was at night, and this was around 11 p.m., they too reported suddenly smelling a quote-unquote strong, sweet odor, and it was coming or wafting in from a nearby window. The victim in this case was a lady by the name of Mrs. Kearney, and she had mentioned that she later told others that, again, she thought it was coming from a window, but she thought it was coming from some flowers just outside the window, so she wasn't necessarily tipped off in terms of it something not being right away. Nothing really triggered into her as far as any kind of red flag or any kind of alarms, because the way that she described the smell, which was strong but yet sweet, she easily thought, oh, okay, it's just the flowers that are outside. But then something strange started happening. The smell, whatever this odor was becoming more and more stronger. And in this case, her body was also affected, but in a different manner from yet the other two victims that I described. So again, the first victim was coughing, the second victim was paralyzed, so was the neighbor. This time around, the third victim, Mrs. Kearney, was stating that she was described as losing feeling in her legs. And slowly it was to this point where either her legs became very numb and she couldn't walk, or her legs, she couldn't feel them at all, as if they weren't there. And so imagine trying to walk on something like that. You wouldn't get too far, and so she wasn't able to move afterward. She wasn't necessarily paralyzed from what I read on there, but rather it was mainly that her legs, she reported losing feeling in her legs to the point that she wasn't able to move, like walk around. She also had her sister at that time in her place, and she said that her sister too noticed this odor, and she's the one that actually was the second person to corroborate that yes, it was coming from an open bedroom window. But when they went, they were able to at least contact the police to see what was happening. And the police came over. I'm guessing that they weren't able to check the window at that point for a while because, again, they were not able to move. But they were able, I mean, at least with regards to the legs, but they were able to move enough to at least contact the police. And when they did so, the police did come over. They actually came over, and by that point, whatever the odor was, whatever this gas was, it was gone. So unfortunately, the police were not able to find any evidence of whatever the smell was that the two ladies were staying. Something was coming through the window and it was affecting us in this way. The police just weren't able to find it. Now here's the interesting point of that incident. After the police left, Mrs. Kearney's husband, a guy by the name of Bert Kearney, he's the one that returned home from his job. He was apparently working as a taxi driver, and so he was probably working late into the night. And so when he came back home, he's the one that actually saw this Mad Gasser, and here's what he describes. He saw the Mad Gasser first because he saw a quote-unquote strange man close to the bedroom window where that odor, where the two ladies were saying it was coming from. And Mr. Kearney immediately went on the defensive, and he got out of his car. He started running towards whoever this person was, the one that was standing or peering through the bedroom window. That whoever that person was ran, and escaped. So unfortunately, Mr. Kearney was not able to catch this person right then and there. How fascinating it would have been, because this, as far as I can tell, was one of the only incidences where someone was as close as possible to catching this Mad Gasser, and it would have been true as to their existence. But no, unfortunately, Mr. Kearney was not able to catch them, but he did catch a description, and here's what he says. This is the actual information. He said, Mr. Kearney's description painted the Gasser as a tall man dressed in dark clothing, wearing a tight-fitting cap. And once this happened, then the common description afterward by the local newspapers, again, nobody having really real credit associated with who came up with this term, but somebody did in those local newspapers, and that was when the first description came about as the assailant being the Mad Gasser. And once that moniker took place, everybody started using it thereafter. So, and again, here you're looking at what is at least a drawing of the Mad Gasser based on this description. You can probably use your own imagination to think of anything else, and you'll see some others, not photos, but drawings with people thinking how the Mad Gasser looks, some of them more fantastical than others. Again, with nobody being able to take video, photographs, certainly not any video, considering the timeline. with it being the 1940s. Everything is just barely due to eyewitness, and when you consider that this was done, in this case Mr. Kearney, seeing this Mad Gasser at the dark of night, and on top of that, this Mad Gasser fleeing and escaping during a chase, it's kind of hard for somebody to try to catch a good eyewitness account right then and there. So it being in this case a loose description of a tall man dressed in dark clothing wearing a tight-fitting cap, that's pretty much as good as we're going to get when it comes to the description of this Mad Gasser. Now, the first actual physical evidence of whatever the Mad Gasser was using happened a couple days later. That third attack, again, was on September 1st. This next incident occurred on September 5th, once again at night, and this happened at the house of a couple called Carl and Beulah Cordes. They say that they were either coming into their home at night, maybe from a late night, late dinner, maybe they had visited some friends, or maybe they were actually in their home and they were going out, maybe just on their porch to try to enjoy the rest of the night together peacefully. But whatever happened, whenever they left outside by their porch, they saw what was to be a piece of paper, like a white cloth of some sort. They described it as being barely larger than a common handkerchief, and it was sitting right there on their porch. So when you see something like that, it kind of stands out, because if you imagine a standard porch, a wooden porch, and then to suddenly see a small white object like this sitting in the middle of the porch, then you're going to see it and you're going to inspect it. And that's exactly what the wife, Mrs. Beulah Cordes, did. She said she picked up the cloth and then she smelled it. For whatever reason, she decided to smell it. I don't know about you or me, but whenever I see something like that, if I would see something like that, either on my residence or my front area, I'm not going to smell it. I'm just going to throw it away. But for whatever reason, she decided to smell it. And once she did so, she instantly became violently ill. She was affected in yet a different manner than any of the other victims. In this case, her body, her face began to swell. Her mouth and throat had an intense burning sensation, and then like the other victims beforehand, she also began to vomit. But she was affected in a different manner because, again, none of the other victims had their face swell, and she was the only one, it seems, that had an intense burning in her throat all of a sudden. And then she also experienced partial paralysis on her legs. And that was enough for Mr. Cordes to immediately contact the authorities, who came over. The police apparently came over once again, in this case to their residence. They analyzed whatever that piece of cloth was, how it was done. I don't know what the analyzation was. I don't know if they took it anywhere and maybe tried to test the elements or the materials with that cloth, whatever it was. But they, at least based on their analysis, they said there were no explanations on how Mrs. Cordes was affected in that manner, and there was no trace of any kind of special materials with that handkerchief. So, and so the idea was, they were speculating, well, why was this cloth there in the first place? Because everything else that happened with all the previous victims, whatever this odor was, it was coming in from a window. And so it would be hard if this person, this Mad Gasser, were trying to do the same thing to this couple, the Cordes. If he was trying to have the gas coming in from a window, it would have been hard for him to do so, because now if you place something on the porch, that odor would have had to have been directed to the window. So they were speculating and thinking to themselves, well, why would he have left it on the porch rather than, let's say, a window sill or anything right out nearby the window? And they thought that most likely he did it because whoever this Mad Gasser was knew at that time that the Cordes had a dog. The dog would have been somebody that would have immediately known that there was somebody out there, let's say, scavenging the area, standing outside the windowsill, and so this dog would have created a large amount of noise, barking, whatever, in terms of trying to get the attention of everybody, and that's something that this Mad Gasser did not want. So when that happened, to prevent that from happening, the Mad Gasser they speculated took that handkerchief with whatever odor, whatever gas he was using at that time, and then placed it on the porch, because also a dog's natural inclination against something unfamiliar is to walk up to it, sniff it, and then the dog would have been severely affected, because if, in this case, Mrs. Cordis at least, was impacted in that manner, and she's a human, a standard human who weighs far more than a dog, imagine what would have happened to the dog if the dog would have smelled something like this. So those are some of the incidences associated with the Mad Gasser attack. There was actually several other, there's at least, I counted some around at least 10 or so people that were victimized by the Mad Gasser. However, anything with the Mad Gasser, it was pretty much nobody was able to, again, find anything concrete, anything in terms of let's say actual 100% physical evidence of who he was. Instead, it was mainly just speculation. Apparently, somebody was able to see him, but whoever this person was, they thought he was a person carrying what was called a flit gun, which is, you'll see a picture of it here. It's one of those type of guns that's used where you can spray pesticide directly into any kind of place normally reserved for, let's say, flowers or grass or anything like that. And that's where, again, that goes into a much more fantastical area, because if you have that, then you have somebody who is clearly almost into it's hard to describe it any other way, but almost into a super villain type mode, where you have somebody who has a weapon, a customized weapon of sorts with their own customized gas, and they're purposely trying to use it to instill fright towards the middle of the night, towards the city. That's where it starts getting into a weird phase on there. Others, in fact, have also mentioned that they've seen the Gasser there during that time, but not only that, but they saw that it was actually a female dressed as a man. How? I don't know. Maybe it was somebody who was again wearing the dark clothes that was described earlier, but based on the silhouette commonly associated with a woman, they thought, okay, so this Mad Gasser is actually a woman. It's not anybody that is a man, as previously described. Others had also apparently said that they saw a blue vapor associated with the gas, or the Mad Gasser trying to use something, and whatever was emanating from this quote-unquote gassing machinery, it created a blue vapor, and that was the gas itself that the Mad Gasser was using. So whatever happened, again, there were multiple other people stating circumstances surrounding their encounter or evidence associated with the Mad Gasser, and whatever happened, it just took on a life of its own. In fact, it's been described at this point that there were so many incidences that the chief of police was stating that at this point it was more of a mass hysteria, and he actually took it to a point where there was no gas attacks at all, and then it was more likely just somebody that did start something, but in this case others eventually started thinking, it's happening to me, I see him, he's right there. And when that happens, then you'll have many false reports, or at least people thinking that they're true, but then in actuality they're false reports, and then that's where they're multiple occurrences happen when they really didn't. In fact, that chief of police, he took it to another level and said that he thought that these quote-unquote attacks were not the cause of some person out there that was trying to create fright and fear and became known as a Mad Gasser, but rather it was accidentally triggered by some chemicals from a nearby industrial facility. And so whatever this industrial facility, maybe there was a leak in one of the containers, maybe there was a valve that was not necessarily tightened all the way. Whatever happened, there was some leak, and this gas wafted in through the town, and due to the nature of people having their homes either the windows open or closed, depending on how cold something is, then they each experience different occurrences based on someone who, let's say, had their window open that night and found the gas coming into their room, or somebody that didn't and didn't experience anything. It all depended on, again, the chief of police, and thinking that it was more random occurrences. Now, as to the idea that there was an actual Mad Gasser, let's go with that first, and who he was, or who she was in some cases. There's the idea that it was a person by the name of Farley Llewellyn, and the reason for this was because there was apparently a gentleman named Farley Llewellyn who was studying at the University of Illinois, and he was a chemistry student, and he was apparently isolated from everyone in that university because at that time people thought of him as being either gay or homosexual, and at that time to be associated with that, it was almost taboo, and so people were not very keen on being close to him or being tied to him in any way whatsoever. And so the idea permeated that this apparently gave him the vengeance that he needed to try to commit these attacks, because here he was being shunned by these people. Whether he was gay or not, it's not really up to discuss on that point, but the idea being that at least he was shunned, and that caused him out of spite to create victims to try to make attacks on the people who shunned him, because apparently those that were attacked, the myriad of attacks that I was mentioning again, 10 plus, so many of them were people that were tied to Farley Llewellyn, and these were people that had either attended high school with him or people that knew him there at the university or were relatives of the people there at the university. Again, that to me sounds a little bit more fantastical, because he was a quote-unquote accomplished chemistry student, and so now you have somebody who knew chemistry, and you have somebody that not only blatantly knew chemistry but decided that he wanted to take vengeance upon those by applying said chemistry knowledge into creating a gas. Again, that sounds more fantastical. That's more along the realms of what I mentioned earlier, like a comic book supervillain, where you read those things where somebody that has knowledge about something suddenly is able to use that to their advantage to become either a hero or a superhero or a villain in some cases. And I don't know, it was to me something far more outside the realm. And then there are even other suggestions that whatever this Mad Gasser was, it was actually a UFO alien of some sort, somebody that was there trying to observe the town. And the way they were able to do this was either to try to attack their victims, maybe try to see if they could I guess whatever their observations were at that time, if the victims were knowing that they were going to be there, that the aliens were going to be there, in this case the alien peering over the window, then the alien would have a means of paralyzing this victim and preventing them from finding out that the alien is there. Again, that's a little bit more out there, that's a little bit more outside what could be more common sense. It reminds me of that Flatwoods monster that I did on one of my Cryptids and Monsters videos a little while back, where that noxious gas or odor also caused the people to cough incessantly, vomit, and so forth. So that happening in two places at once, two places separately, I don't know, I'm having a harder time believing that at that point. I think ultimately, in my opinion, as I had mentioned at the beginning of the video, I think that there really was somebody that was using a peeping Tom or whoever that was trying to make let's say some views through some videos, through some windows, and he was caught. But then at that time, maybe there was, let's say, a leak at some kind of gas chemical, and then it just took on a life of its own. That's what I think more naturally happened, where it was a real set of incidences that all happened in around the same time, but the way that they happened, people thought that it was going towards another area, and so once that took on a life of its own, then people were far more inclined to let's say, believe that, oh, no, it's somebody dressed up as Mad Gasser type material, and that's where the urban legend comes from. So what do you guys think? Have you heard of this urban legend before? This Mad Gasser of Mattoon? If anyone lived in and around that area, near Mattoon, Illinois, if anyone had any relatives, any other stories, that are tied into this, please, share them below. It'd be interesting to find out if anyone has any more experiences to share as well. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.